China has this very challenging situation that they're facing. On the one hand, they do support Russia's position to a large extent. They want to see a weaker U.S.
Alex Kazan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, you're the Chief Commercial Officer at Eurasia Group, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about Eurasia itself.
Of course. So Eurasia Group is a political risk advisory firm. We were founded about 25 years ago, and we've grown a ton since then. No longer confined to Eurasia. We started. It was founded to really focus on the post-Soviet states and that period of time when they were really emerging into the global economy. But since then, we've grown into a global firm covering the entire world. We work with a range of clients, financial services, all sorts of sectors of the economy, tech firms, and we basically help them understand what's going on in the world, make some sense of it, and help them understand what it means for their business.
Would a typical client be a global organization that had offices in certain countries and they want to understand exactly what the sort of political or geopolitical risk could be there?
Yeah, really we have two sets of clients. One set is exactly as you described, typically multinationals. They work around the world. They need to understand the different risks they face, operational risks, business risks. Then we also work with asset allocators, people who invest around the world, sovereign debt investors, people who run global equity funds, and they need a good understanding of political risk to their portfolios, and we help them with that.
Okay, so they can kind of give some sort of formula or number to political risk to help them understand what the volatility may be in that country or that market?
Well, there's different approaches. Some people do take a very quantitative approach, which is you sort of identify, political risk as a factor and you give it scores and things like that. And then there's people who take more of a qualitative approach to it, really, more of a kind of a narrative or thematic approach.
I do want to focus on today, on the geopolitical tensions we've got going on today. But if we could just start by talking about a bigger theme, I think, which is very interesting, is when we had globalization for so many years, we now seem to be a few years into deglobalization. Is that something that you agree with, first of all? And secondly, is this deglobalization going to continue? And is that going to add to geopolitical tensions?
So my response to that is a little nuanced. I certainly agree with the notion that globalization hit its high water mark, but that was probably about 10 years ago.
Okay.
You had a number of political and economic trends in place that I would date pretty much to the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Part of that was political, right? You had the resurgence of populism. Basically, a lot of that was a backlash from a lot of the losers of globalization, both real losers and people who perceived that they were losing. Brexit falls into that story. I think the election of Trump in the US fall into that story. So you have this political backlash that started to create political headwinds to globalization. Then you also had a number of developments, I think, on the structure of the global economy, changes in the Chinese labor market, changes in the utilization of technology that also pushed back a little bit on globalization. But what has happened more recently is that the geopolitical foundations for globalization have really weakened quite a bit. Part of that
specifically about trade, or
so trade is part of it, certainly. So part of the answer is that the institutions that supported globalization no longer are really particularly fit for purpose, and I think the World Trade Organization is a very good example of that.
Okay.
But a lot of that comes from what I think is the primary driver of these headwinds to globalization, which is the deterioration in the US-China relationship. So during that sort of ascendant phase of globalization, you had much more constructive engagement around commercial and economic and trade and financial architecture. You had this sort of process of convergence that involved the emerging markets and the developed countries, but it was really, a lot of that was a US-China story.
Right.
That's no longer true, right? We've shifted from this more constructive engagement to very clear strategic competition. A lot of people like to say, oh, that's just because of some decisions made by the Trump administration, but I would argue that it's deeply structural And the fact that you see real continuity of those policies from the Biden administration, and in many cases intensification of them, points to the structural nature of it. But one quick additional thing on that. I don't really like the term deglobalization. I think a much better way to describe it is fragmentation of the global economy. The reason is, if you look at the data, it doesn't really support the notion of deglobalization. If you look at global trade to global GDP, that ratio hit its high water mark at the time of the global financial crisis, and really has stayed steady. But you haven't seen this sort of unwinding. So I think, and I also think that you'll continue to see high levels of trade, cross-border finance over the next decade, but it'll be much less efficient, much more friction, more sand in the gears. And that's why I think this notion of fragmentation covers it a lot better. Companies, organizations will continue to be global, but it's going to be more expensive, and it's going to have a lot more friction associated with it, and more political and regulatory risk.
So in fact, the amount of trade that will continue will actually not change too much. It will just be inflationary.
So I'm not sure that that's exactly how I would formulate the argument, but to the extent that there are headwinds pushing against globalization, there are some elements of that that are inflationary, right? I mean, one of the structural factors that have reduced inflation over the last 30, 40 years has very clearly been globalization. So to the extent that there is any, if that gets more expensive, there's pushback to that, that is something that contributes to inflation. Now, I'm not going to suggest that that is going to be the primary driver of inflation, particularly over the cycle, but I think if you're thinking structurally through economic cycles, that is a reason to believe that maybe there are some structural reasons why inflation might be a little bit more elevated going forward than it was during that sort of ascendant phase of globalization.
Now, Alex, I do want to talk about the current situation in Ukraine, but I've seen you speak before, and I thought it was very interesting. I'd love you to go into more detail now about the role of emerging markets and the sort of more developed markets. And I think the point you were trying to make was emerging markets are by definition more unstable. And when their economies are doing better, geopolitical tensions could rise in those areas. Am I on the right track? Or?
Well, yeah, the argument, to be clear, this was an argument that was made pre-COVID and pre the war in Ukraine. So I'll talk about how it's changed a little bit. But the thinking was that emerging markets by definition just have higher levels of risk. They have been growing over the last couple of decades faster than the developed world, which typically has lower levels of risk. So just as a matter of pure math, the sort of a global economy weighted political risk index is going to be going higher as that process continues. Now, what has changed, and I think is really notable, and it's also related to our previous conversation on these forces of deglobalization, is that emerging markets are going to face a much more difficult time going forward. They were hit very badly by COVID. They didn't have the same fiscal resources and the ability to put in place massive fiscal packages that wealthier countries did. And they were much slower to have deployment of vaccines. So we're still having some suffering from COVID.
On the flip side, aren't some of these emerging markets sort of net commodity sellers, and with the price of commodities being generally quite strong, does that help them out a little bit?
Some, but the problem with that is in part because some commodities that have been especially high food commodities are hurting consumers in emerging markets. So it's a mixed bag.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, some net exporters are going to benefit, at least from sort of a balance of payments perspective, clearly. But I think given the fact that a lot of consumers in emerging markets are being hit very hard by this, it's a little bit more of a nuanced story. And just, I think the simplest...
now you mention it, I know there's some countries like India springs to mind who actually banned exports of certain foods because they couldn't, then they needed to feed their own country first, basically.
We're seeing that from a number of places. Argentina has put restrictions on wheat exports. Indonesia has put export restrictions on palm oil. you're seeing that one of the things I'm actually most concerned about going forward in the near term, actually, is a food crisis, a hunger crisis that really hits poorer countries, especially sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, some parts of the Middle East.
So why don't you talk? Could you talk a little bit more about that? That sounds pretty interesting. It's like, how can these countries stop that food crisis happening? I mean,
well, it's very difficult. I mean, it will require a global solution. It's difficult because it's not just about prices. It's also about just scarcity of actual foodstuffs and getting it to the parts of the world that need it. So you've had a number of factors that are driving this. The most direct is Russia's invasion of Ukraine actually has stopped just logistically the ability to export wheat from Ukraine and parts of Russia, which are major suppliers, particularly to North Africa, of wheat. Then you've had very high fertilizer prices and problems with availability of fertilizer. That's made worse by higher energy prices, particularly natural gas, which is a big input into a lot of fertilizers. And then you have all these, logistical and other supply chain issues coming out of COVID. So you have this sort of perfect storm that is really hitting in food. And we, Eurasia Group, just did a big study where we estimated that up to 240 million additional people could go into what the World Food Program defines as food insecure over the next 6 to 9 months.
So is one of the solutions possibly that countries are going to have to just naturally become more self-sufficient, or we're going to change or revolutionize the way we do agriculture?
Well, so I think both. I think the longer term response to this is more innovation, more investment in agricultural technology.
We've just got too used to being able to import whatever we want.
But I think politically there will be a push for more self-sufficiency. We're seeing this, every time there is a shock, we see the reaction of policymakers to try to make sure that it doesn't happen again in the future, right? So when you had the supply chain issues and the tariffs that first came out of the US-China tensions a couple years ago, you had a response by governments to, we need to insulate ourselves from that, particularly around some of the, technology goods and services that were impacted. Then you have COVID, and you see governments respond by, okay, we need to make sure that we're never going to be short of, medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, et cetera. Now you have a food shock, and the response will be, let's build self-sufficiency. The issue of that is, with something like agriculture that is dependent on the vagaries of weather, one of the factors I didn't mention is you have a historic drought in parts of Africa right now. Self-sufficiency at the country level can be difficult, especially in places that don't have great agricultural infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and logistics to get it from where it's grown to where it's needed. So self-sufficiency, while it sounds good and politically it makes sense, from a
practical point of
view, and from a the perspective of a resilient global food system, it's not automatically the best thing to do.
Well, we'll keep a close eye on that. Now, to talk specifically about the situation in Ukraine, perhaps you could just give us your current thoughts about. I'm sure it's an impossible question to see how this plays out, but your current thoughts of kind of how it's gone so far and what the implications you think will be.
Yeah, I think from a forward-looking perspective, the statement that I have the most amount of confidence around is that this is going to be a long, protracted conflict.
Are you talking years?
Yeah, absolutely. That doesn't necessarily mean years of active fighting and combat, but for those who are looking for some sort of quick off-ramp, right, some sort of diplomatic solution.
If that was going to happen, it would have happened.
It's not so much that it would have happened already, it's that it's very difficult to see a diplomatic solution that is viable for the Ukrainians and Zelensky.
Okay, because of the players involved.
Yes. So our near-term outlook is that you will continue to have brutal fighting in the east of the country for Russia's establishing control of the Donbass region and building a land bridge to Crimea, which they already occupied following the earlier invasion in 2014. At that point, we suspect that they'll probably sort of declare victory and try to establish a line of control and sort of, sue for peace at that point. The Ukrainians are not going to accept more than 20% of their territory under Russian occupation. So I think at that point you settle into sort of a war of attrition. There may not be the kind of, active, huge-scale battles that we're seeing right now, but there's not very unlikely in our view to be a diplomatic settlement at that point. You will have a war of attrition, and potentially you can settle into sort of a frozen conflict where there's not a lot of active fighting, but you don't have any long-lasting political solution.
And what are the options for the rest of the world or the Western world to try and, like, you know, bring an end to the war?
Yeah, so the response in many regards has been remarkable. The sanctions regime that the US and Europe have put in place is absolutely unprecedented. I think the Russians were, and Putin in particular, did not expect that, right? The thinking was that the West was in disarray, the US is hopelessly divided, the Europeans care much more about economic security than they do any principles or national security. Putin tested that, and it was wrong. The response has been strong, it's been coherent. You've seen a much stronger transatlantic alliance between the US and Europe, and NATO effectively is working. But the issue with that is that Putin is now framing this not as a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but a conflict between Russia and NATO over Ukraine.
Do you think Putin kind of made a mistake thinking that China would be right behind them and just assumed they would be a strong ally?
Well, I don't know that it was a mistake as much as, I mean, I don't know what his expectations were for what China would do. China is in a difficult position, right? Shortly before the invasion, as you know, they announced this sort of expanded relationship with Russia. Not quite a formal alliance, there's no security alliance. They have no obligation to help each other militarily or financially in case of conflict, but they vowed a much stronger relationship.
But you think that's the way it will remain? There will be no military...
It will remain rhetorical and diplomatic support, and diplomatic support with limits. China has this very, challenging, situation that they're facing. On the one hand, they do support Russia's position to a large extent. They want to see a weaker U.S. They want to see a U.S. They want to see a sort of reordering of the way global institutions and global...
But they don't want to hurt their trade relationship with the US.
But that's exactly right. So the balancing factor is a stable relationship with the US and Europe is fundamentally important to them at this point in time from an economic stability perspective. Keep in mind that the Chinese economy is facing its toughest year in a very long time. The zero COVID policy that they have been, implemented successfully at first, but increasingly one that is creating headwinds to the economy, is creating a major challenge, and they're going to struggle to hit 3% growth this year in our view.
And finally, Alex, I just want to ask you, there's commentators I read seem to feel like Europe is going to be unable to avoid a recession at this point, given the situation with Ukraine and Russia. Do you have a view as to what the outlook is like for the Chinese economy or the European economy or even the US?
Yeah, so we're facing headwinds globally across all the major economies, and I think the direction of growth is certainly toward lower growth in each of the three major economies that you mentioned. I think if I were to sort of rank them, right now the Chinese economy looks the most vulnerable. They have an official growth target of roughly 5%. I think they're going to struggle to certainly struggle to hit that, probably more likely around 3%. That's reported growth, actual growth, take off another percentage point or 2. Europe, there's a lot of questions, I think, or variables that we're not entirely sure about how they're going to play out in terms of access to Russian gas. Certainly there are some potential shocks there if Russia were to abruptly shut off access to gas. That would be a huge hit to German industrial activity. So you have a lot of downside risks for the European economy coming from this. The U.S. is also facing headwinds, also just the sort of spillover from slower growth in China and Europe. But given the strength of the labor market, but I think it probably looks a little bit more robust than Europe and China at this point.
Okay. And final question, Alex. I don't know if you're an energy expert, but do you see oil just continuing to go higher through 150? Do you have a view on that?
I'm not an energy expert, and I don't make price forecasts on oil, but I do think, the view on the oil markets that I have the highest confidence in is that you're going to continue to see a lot of volatility driven by geopolitical factors. Clearly, the fact that oil is now subject to sanctions, coming out of Russia, is a big driver. The extent to which the Germans are able to reduce reliance on on that as part of this, since you have the exception around pipeline imports. So I think the key point from my perspective is that oil right now is really driven by a lot of geopolitical factors rather than economic drivers alone. The demand side would point toward less upward pressure, just given the slowing economy in China. That's always been a very important variable. But you have all these supply side factors and political risks that make it a lot more complicated and nuanced a story. So I think that that's going to contribute to a lot of volatility going forward.
Alex, a fascinating conversation, a very important one. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.